Welcome to the Private School Leader Podcast, where private school leaders learn how to thrive and not just survive as they serve and lead their schools. I strongly believe that it is possible to have a long and happy and fulfilling career as a private school leader. And my passion is to help you figure out exactly how to do just that right here on the Private School Leader Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Minkus. So I want to hit you with a couple of quotes as we start today's episode. First of all, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. You've probably heard that before. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And then here's another quote. Focus on progress, not perfection. Focus on progress, not perfection. And so, of course, the idea is that something that's done is better than, and if it's not done perfectly, that's better than something that's done really, really well, but that we don't finish. And when it comes to perfectionism, I know sometimes I struggle with that, and everyone listening to this podcast, you might struggle with it in to a varying degree, but it can definitely impact what we do as private school leaders because we have so much to do, and if we try to do everything perfectly, we are going to have a problem that's even bigger than the current problem we have, which is there's not enough time in the day to get things done. And so I want to give you one more quote that I just thought was very, very interesting. And this is a quote from Brene Brown. And so the quote says, "Understanding the difference between healthy striving and perfectionism is critical to laying down the shield and picking up your life. Research shows that perfectionism hampers success and is often the path to depression, anxiety, addiction, and life paralysis." And just that phrase, the difference between healthy striving and perfectionism, I think that it's important for us to acknowledge if we do lean toward being a perfectionist. But on today's episode of the Private School Leader Podcast, I want to help you with this. And we're going to discuss overcoming perfectionism. A B+ is always better than an incomplete. And so before we jump into that, I want to give you a free resource, and it is called The 7 Strategies to Effectively Deal with Difficult Teachers. And if you stop and think, you might be thinking of a teacher that you would classify as difficult, whether it's their performance or their attitude or just how they interact with their colleagues or maybe how they interact with the kids. And perhaps they're even also hard to deal with when you try to talk to them one-on-one. Well, we all have dealt with difficult teachers over the years, and it takes some confidence, it takes courage, it takes consistency, and it's difficult to do. And so I want to give you a step-by-step plan for free that you can download. And if you go to theprivateschoolleader.com/difficult, you can grab this free guide called The 7 Strategies to Effectively Deal with Difficult Teachers. And just as a thank you for listening to the podcast every week. Again, that's theprivateschoolleader.com/difficult. And I just wanted to thank you so much for listening to the podcast. We're approaching the 100th episode, and some of you have been here since the beginning. And I just hope that you've learned some strategies and that they've helped you as you lead your school, and hopefully maybe gotten some encouragement along the way also. And I'd like to ask for a favor. I would like to ask if you would please share the link for this podcast with another school leader in your life. Just text it to them, email them. And again, if you're not sure if they know about the podcast, just share it. And also, I'd love it if you would think for a moment about an aspiring leader at your school. And, that person that just works really hard and has a great attitude and just adds a ton of value to your school, and you see that potential. Are you thinking of that person right now? Please share the link. Just text it to them or email it to them. I'm really trying to just get this content out there to as many school leaders as possible. We have people listening to this podcast in 57 different countries. We just added Kenya and French Polynesia and Iraq recently. 57 countries all over the world. And the way that we get the word out there is by sharing the link and sharing the content. And so just thank you so much for listening, and thank you for passing along the podcast to another leader or aspiring leader in your life. And then lastly, before we start today's topic, just a quick reminder about Thrive Academy, and that this is something that I've created that I think can really make a difference in your life, in your work, in the way you leave at the end of the day, how much you have left in the tank for your family, for yourself. And, I've been where you are, and I've figured out a way to make this sustainable so that I'm happy and fulfilled, and I want to keep doing this for a long time. And I want you to feel that way also. And so if that sounds interesting, just check it out at Thrive Academy. Check out Thrive Academy at theprivateschoolleader.com/thrive, and all the information will be there for you. privateschoolleader.com/thrive. So I want to start to talk about perfectionism and overcoming perfectionism by sharing a couple of statistics with you. And so there's a woman named Vitaly Buford Harden, and her company, the Harden Group, did some research with the Social Research Lab at the University of Northern Colorado on perfectionism. And her research uncovered a lot of interesting information, and some of the statistics are 86% of people believe that perfectionist expectations impact their work. And so that's not saying that 82% of people are perfectionists, but at times we are. Almost all of us at times are perfectionists. 72% believe perfectionism is harmful to relationship building. And so that's interesting because, when we think of perfectionism, sometimes we just think of our work and the product that we're producing. We don't think about how it impacts our relationships, but it does. 68% of the people in this research believe that perfectionism can lead to burnout. And 66% believe perfectionism leads to fear of failure and conflict avoidance. And 1/3 of all employees are considering leaving their workplace because of perfectionist expectations. And so that's the other thing that might happen is that maybe you're not a perfectionist, but maybe the person that you report to is. And so this is something that is real, and it is I think that at times it can really be a problem. And so that's why we're talking about it today on the podcast, to try to just help identify it, talk about why it's a problem, and then just focus on some strategies to make it better. So let's start with just defining it. What is perfectionism? And so perfectionism is the need to appear or be perfect and setting very high standards for oneself or others. And so that's where the relationship building comes in, is that sometimes perfectionists, it's not just the standards that they have for their own work or their own work ethic or the time they arrive or the time that they leave or the kind of relationships that they have, but they put those expectations onto others. Another thing about perfectionism is that it can manifest in a bunch of different ways. It could be an obsessive concern about making mistakes. It could be a fear of criticism, or it could be overemphasizing flawless results. And I think sometimes that when it comes to perfectionism, that we tend to focus on that last one, that we tend to focus on, well, a perfectionist is the one who, instead of, when we were in school, instead of just writing 3 paragraphs to check the box and get the A for that assignment, instead of writing 3 paragraphs, they wrote 5 pages, but it's not just about the product. It's about a concern with making mistakes and a fear of criticism and in many people, a fixed mindset. Another thing about perfectionism is that it can often lead to burnout, but also, we'll talk about that in a minute, but can lead to a stifling of creativity and innovation. If with perfectionism, you're typically playing it safe, and you're rarely taking that big swing when it comes to innovation or something super creative. And just one last thing, what does, perfectionism look like? Perfectionism at work might look like missed deadlines, wasting time. It might look like you're wasting time. It might look like procrastination, or, and this is really ironic, it might look like a low effort on your part. And so if you're a perfectionist, it's really important to you to get things in on time and to have things done very, very well. But if you're missing deadlines, others that work with you, they might see your perfectionism as like a low productivity, low effort, procrastinating, and it's not that at all. And so sometimes we just need to try to get out of our own way. And we're going to talk about that and how to do that here in a minute. But just before we jump into the 6 strategies to overcome perfectionism, let's spend a moment or two talking about the 7 pitfalls of perfectionism. And this comes from the American Psychological Association. And the 7 pitfalls of perfectionism. Number 1 is burnout. And so we know that burnout is the end state of chronic work stress or chronic stress in our life, and the body just can't handle it anymore, and then it leads to all of the symptoms of burnout. That constant push for perfection can just lead to physical and emotional exhaustion and being disinterested, being detached, being listless, just feeling overwhelmed all the time. So being a perfectionist, it can lead to burnout. Number 2 pitfall of perfectionism is anxiety. So sometimes a perfectionist will overthink things. And as school leaders, we are faced with so many decisions that sometimes we have to, move a little more quickly than we would like to. And so anxiety surrounding perfectionism can slow us down. There can be a lot of stress over deadlines because we want to get it perfect and the deadline is coming. Fear of failure, and it also can cause a low self-image. And even though this person is typically putting out high quality work, they don't see it that way. Okay, number 3 pitfall is paralysis by analysis. And I'm sure that you've experienced that. I know I've experienced that, where you just have so much overthinking and so much overanalyzing that you just get stuck and you can't make a decision or take action. And that doesn't mean that if you get paralysis by analysis that you're a perfectionist, but it's much worse for someone who leans in that direction as far as perfectionism. And paralysis by analysis is not going to serve us well as private school leaders. The number 4 on our list of pitfalls of perfectionism is fear of failure. So a perfectionism can lead to an intense fear of failure and make it difficult to take risks or to try new approaches. And I mentioned that a few minutes ago about creativity and innovation. If we have a fear of failure, we're going to play it safe all the time. And playing it safe often looks like doing it the way we've always done it. And so that can be problematic in the future. Number 5 pitfall is reduced innovation. That goes along with what I just said. Number 6, missed deadlines. Again, putting all that stress and overthinking, and it looks like procrastination, but it's really the perfectionism that's creeping in. And then number 7 pitfall is extreme thinking. So let's talk about extreme thinking for a moment. Perfectionists may view themselves and life in general through the lens of extremes, such as like good or bad, and there's nothing in between. Victory or failure, and there's nothing in between. Always or never, and there's nothing in between. And so this type of thinking, this extremes thinking, can increase anxiety and leave no room for mistakes or obstacles. And let's face it, when we're trying to lead our schools, we have to be nimble, we have to be agile, we have to be flexible. And if we see everything in extremes, always, never, good, bad, victory, failure, we have to sometimes live in that gray and then find elegant solutions to complex problems through creativity. And that extreme thinking can really kind of hinder that and to block it when we're trying to be creative in our problem solving. And let's face it, we have to be pretty creative in our problem solving as private school leaders. So then that brings us to the 6 strategies to overcome perfectionism. And so we've talked about what is perfectionism. We've talked about some of the pitfalls or the dangers or the problems that could come up for us as leaders when we're leaning in that direction as far as perfectionism. But now let's talk about 6 strategies to overcome it. And I want to pause for just one moment and just say, it's not like we're saying that this is a disease and that it needs to be eradicated or needs to be taken off like a mole or cut out like it's a tumor. There's nothing wrong with you if you're a perfectionist. Some of the best and most productive and most sincere and precise people in the world are perfectionists. And so, I want to be clear that when we're talking about strategies to overcome this, that there's nothing wrong with you if you tend towards perfectionism. But that being said, I just listed 7 problems that perfectionism can lead to. And when we're under stress leading our schools, I think it's really important to have an awareness and think about it this way. If wherever you are at on the scale of perfectionism of, say, let's 1 to 10, okay? If you're above a 6, above a 5, really what the goal is here with these strategies is to just dial it down just a little bit, okay? Dial it down a little bit. And if you're at a 9 or a 10, maybe dial it down a couple notches, just to preserve you for the long term, because no one can be perfect all the time. And then we judge ourselves unfavorably, and then that leads to feelings about our work, and it's not healthy for us emotionally. So I just wanted to kind of give that little sidebar disclaimer about the fact that there's nothing wrong with you, but we are going to talk about how to overcome perfectionism. Okay, 6 strategies. Number 1, embrace the B+ mentality. Number 2, set realistic goals. Number 3, don't sacrifice progress on the altar of perfection. Number 4, encourage a growth mindset. Number 5, delegate and trust your team. And number 6, practice self-compassion. All right, so number 1, embrace the B+ mentality. The title of this episode is Overcoming Perfectionism. A B+ is always better than an incomplete. So it might make you cringe if you lean toward perfectionism to even think about getting anything other than an A or an A+ on a test. If you think back over your schooling, college, high school, middle school, that, oh my gosh, a B+, that would be terrible. But I want you to compare a B+ on your report card to an incomplete. And now I want you to think about your report card, quote unquote, report card as a private school leader. There are many times where perfectionism can become paralyzing, and we just need to sometimes have to lean into aiming for good enough instead of striving for perfection. And, in many cases, completing a task at a very high standard, even if it's not perfect, is way more beneficial than leaving it unfinished. And so, again, I just want to try, and nothing happens overnight. Nothing is like, oh, okay, well, I'll just embrace the B+ mentality. Like, if you lean toward perfectionism, then that's easier said than done, because this is a pattern that you've been in for many, many years. But you have to change your mindset and your mentality and just try over time to focus on high standard, high quality work, but not perfect. Okay. So I think that oftentimes that high quality work, that it is better than good enough. But then if we lean toward perfectionism, we just spend so much more time on like the tiny little details that really don't matter. And just for the sake of brevity and for tactically moving forward and getting everything done that we have to as a private school leader, it's going to be really tough if you're not embracing that B+ mentality. And so maybe an example could be, instead of spending endless hours perfecting a board report or a presentation, just have your aim be, I want to deliver a comprehensive and well-prepared report and PowerPoint presentation within this reasonable time frame. And so this allows for a timely delivery of actually getting it done, and maybe can reduce your stress. So I'm not trying to make it easier than it sounds. I'm just putting it out there as something to consider. Is B+ better than incomplete on your report card? If you're a perfectionist, visualize a report card for you as a private school leader that your boss, whether it's the head of school or the board chair, is grading you as a B+ better than an incomplete. Okay? All right, number 2 on our list of strategies for overcoming perfectionism is set realistic goals. So, achievable goals can manage expectations and reduce pressure. And so sometimes I think that the perfectionism comes out when we set the goals and the goals are unrealistic. And then we get stuck when we can't reach those goals, because no one could reach those goals with any amount of time. And so, for example, if you're like implementing a new master schedule or implementing a new curriculum, or you're doing, reaccreditation, you can't just do that in a week. You can't even do it in a month, and you can't do it by yourself. And so it's important to remember that the goals that you're setting, that's really, really important. The goals and the time frame that you give yourself to complete the goal, that has a lot to do with managing the perfectionism. Because typically, if you're setting unrealistic goals and an unrealistic time frame, you're just setting yourself up for feeling bad and for not getting it done on time, and kicking yourself and telling yourself a negative story about yourself. And that doesn't have to be that way. Okay. And so I think that it helps when you can set realistic goals with a realistic time frame. So this brings us to number 3, which is don't sacrifice progress on the altar of perfection. Don't sacrifice progress on the altar of perfection. And so if we can shift that mindset to value progress over perfection, we started the episode with that quote, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? So if we can celebrate small victories and focus on, okay, I worked this much time on this product or this project today. I think that sometimes as school leaders in general, but school leaders that lean toward perfectionism in particular, that we just put all of the eggs in the basket of the finished product, and we don't value the progress over time. And then that also leads to us not acknowledging our team and the contributions that they're making in the classroom or in the school. And that is terrible for teacher morale and motivation. And so my point is that even if it's uncomfortable for you to focus on progress over perfection, you need to set that example for your team. And then also give them positive feedback as they reach different milestones with a big project, with a big, curriculum implementation or accreditation and self-study, or a capital campaign, with your institutional advancement team, or whatever it is that's going on in your school. Progress. Don't sacrifice progress on the altar of perfection. I wish that all private school leaders could fall in love with progress more than products. And so that's really, really important for all leaders, and especially for those that maybe lean more towards perfectionism. And then number 4 is encourage a growth mindset. And I did an episode number 4, which I'll link in the show notes at theprivateschoolleader.com/episode 97. Episode 4 is called Turn Pedestal Kids into Gritty Kids by Implementing Growth Mindset. And so if you don't know exactly what growth mindset is, with Carol Dweck, Stanford University, 30 years of research, fixed mindset, growth mindset, pedestal kids, gritty kids, neuroplasticity is how we learn, and how actually making mistakes is supported by research, that's what makes us smarter. Those things are all in episode 4. I'm not going to get into a full lesson on growth mindset in this episode. I will link it and you can go back and check it out. But just to promote a culture in your school where mistakes are seen as learning opportunities rather than failures. Someone with a fixed mindset sees a mistake as a failure instead of an opportunity to learn. And so if we can help reduce the fear of making mistakes and encourage a little bit of creativity and innovation, if we're modeling that, that's what we want from our kids. That's what we want from our teachers, is to take those little risks and to see that making a mistake is part of the growth process. But if we're leaning toward being a perfectionist, we don't want any parts of those mistakes. And so that's not something that is going to serve us well, and it's certainly not going to set an example of having a growth mindset for our teachers or our students. And that brings us to number 5, and that is to delegate and trust your team. And this is hard for private school leaders in general, but I think it's even more difficult for school leaders that lean toward perfectionism, because you know that you can do it better than anybody else, and so you do it, and that leads to you doing almost everything. And that's a recipe for disaster, because more and more and more and more things will end up on your plate. And I know that it's hard to delegate something and know that someone isn't going to do it as well as you're going to do it. But if you just decide you're going to do everything, then why do you need a team? Why do you need these teachers? Why do you need these other administrators if you have a leadership team? You're the head of school. You just do it all yourself. That seems ridiculous, doesn't it? That's because it is ridiculous. And so I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying that it's something that, first of all, it preserves you. Second of all, it elevates your team and shows that you trust them. Because if you keep everything to do yourself because you want it to be done perfectly, that's sending a message to your team that you don't trust them. And I don't think that's the message that you want to send. And also, you need to recognize that there's others on the team, whether they're teachers, whether they're other admins, they can contribute valuable skills and perspectives that you don't have. Everyone's different. Everyone has a different set of skills. And if you're doing everything, it is going to stunt the growth of your school, and it's going to put you on a path to burnout. And so we need to do a better job in general as school leaders to delegate. But if we lean a little towards perfectionism, we need to make sure that we're embracing that with both hands. And that brings us to number 6, and that is practice self-compassion. And I think that, again, in general, as school leaders, that we are not kind enough to ourselves. We're kind to our team. We're kind to our teachers. We're kind to our students. We're kind to the parents. But we're not kind to ourselves. And that's a really big problem. And to just understand that it's okay to not be perfect, and that your worth is not defined by your achievements or by the quote-unquote perfection of those achievements or those products. That board report or that self-study or that meeting that you had with the parent or that decision that you made, it's ludicrous to think that we're going to get everything perfect. But the problem is that even though that's a fact that we're not going to get it right all the time, if our standard is that it's going to be perfect every time, then think how many times we're going to be disappointed. Think how many times we're going to be unkind to ourselves. Think about the story that we're going to tell ourselves. We give more grace and kindness to everyone else around us and don't give that kindness or that grace to ourselves ever. Hardly ever. And so this looks like prioritizing self-care, reminding yourself that mistakes are part of the growth process. And again, you want to model this for your staff. You beating yourself up over things that probably don't matter as much as you think they do is not going to serve you well, and it's not going to set a good example for your team. And so I want to revisit this quote from Brene Brown. She said, "Understanding the difference between healthy striving and perfectionism is critical to laying down the shield and picking up your life." So my challenge to you would be to think deeply about where are you on that scale of perfectionism, and to lean into this idea of healthy striving and to try to set down that idea of being perfect. And so the big takeaways from today's episode, the 7 pitfalls of perfectionism are burnout, anxiety, paralysis by analysis, fear of failure, reduced innovation, missed deadlines, and extreme thinking. And the 6 strategies for overcoming perfectionism are: number 1, embrace the B+ mentality. Number 2, set realistic goals. Number 3, don't sacrifice progress on the altar of perfection. Number 4, encourage a growth mindset. Number 5, delegate and trust your team. And number 6, practice self-compassion. And my call to action for you today is to take 15 minutes and to just write down on a piece of paper, B+ is always better than an incomplete, just on a piece of paper, and then jot down any reflections or any thoughts that come up for you with that phrase, and then just write down one action that you can take to change that. So you're going to write at the top of a piece of paper, B+ is always better than an incomplete. Jot down a couple things of how that shows up in your work, and then write down one action that you can take to change that. And so I just want to remind you once again about the new resource that I have for you for free called the 7 Strategies to Effectively Deal with Difficult Teachers. And this step-by-step plan can give you the confidence and the courage you need to hold your difficult teachers accountable. And you can get that at theprivateschoolleader.com/difficult. And then one last reminder about Thrive Academy, this online course that you can go through step by step, video lesson by video lesson, sustainable strategy by sustainable strategy, and just apply these actions, these strategies in your life, and it will change everything. I really strongly believe that you can go from being in survival mode to thriving at school. And I'd love to teach you how to do that. So check out Thrive Academy at theprivateschoolleader.com/thrive. So I'd love to hear from you, maybe what was a pain point for you over this past year. Also, it could be just what's a strategy that you're using at school that you've heard or learned on the podcast. My email is mark.o.minkus@gmail.com. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast. The show notes are at theprivateschoolleader.com/episode 97. Please write a review and rate the podcast so that the algorithm pushes it out as suggested content to school leaders all over the world. And I'm on social media. Instagram is at the Private School Leader and Twitter is at the PS Leader. And if you got value from this episode, just please share it with another school leader in your life or an aspiring leader at your school. And I've been your host, Mark Minkus. I appreciate you so much, all the amazing hard work that you do for the lucky kids and teachers at your school. And thank you for taking precious time out of your week to join me here today. And I'll see you next time right here on the Private School Leader Podcast. And until then, always remember to serve first, lead second, and make a difference.